We are in bed with books. Thank you for joining us this week. I'm Melissa.
And I'm Bethany. If you'd like to find us outside of wherever you're listening from, then you can find us on our website, inbedwithbookspod.com, on Instagram at inbedwithbookspod, and find us on YouTube for video versions of the podcast and bonus episodes.
So let's jump right in.
Oh.
I'm tired.
Yeah.
Like the holidays are just getting to me.
Yeah. Honestly, it doesn't even feel like Christmas to me. I'm just like, so I've actually been like, so we got our car window broken into in the garage.
Yeah.
I won't go into it. So we don't have like a driver's side window, which is really annoying when you have to like drive.
Yeah.
But,
I can imagine.
Milo put like plastic on it, but that doesn't mean you can see through it. So it's just this like really, so I'm like, I don't really want to go anywhere. It's like kind of my excuse. So I just spent the last couple of weeks, just like my days off, just like vegging out. And it's been really, really nice. Because I know Christmas is coming and I'm not going to be able to do that. And I'm honestly like not shopping for anyone. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably good. It's good.
I think it's a more prevalent thing this year since we're all kind of suffering. So
yeah.
You're definitely not alone there.
Yeah. Like we're like, we have this car window to replace. Like, it's Milo's slow season. Like, it's Christmas lands on the worst time of year, I think. For finances. So,
well, it's funny because having holidays during the winter was usually meant to like, it wasn't supposed to be like a commercial thing. It was supposed to be like a lifting you up. It was supposed to be like a light in the darkness kind of thing.
People used to make gifts.
Yeah, you make gifts, you make like a big meal together, you make alcohol, and you all try to get rid of all the stuff that's about to go bad, basically. And now we're like, if you don't spend over $1,000 on the gifts for all the people that you care about, then you're dead to us.
Yeah.
Like, no.
Yeah.
I think this year that's just what's really weighing me down more than like, I guess I don't really get seasonal affective disorder.
Right.
So that's never really the issue for me. It's just like the everything happening during these next few weeks that usually gets me.
The obligations.
Yeah, the obligations, and like it's probably a social media thing too a little bit because like everyone's like, it's all cute. Everyone's got like this really great excuse to have gorgeous, adorable pictures together, and like everyone's got a tree. This is the first year that I don't have a tree because I live with roommates that have cats. Last year, my tree did not survive it.
Right.
And so that's a little off for me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. We have a little tree. It's like this. It's literally like this big.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And
so that way,
nice.
When it falls, it's less damage.
Yeah, exactly. We just chuck it out the window. No. My cats have never been tree cats, so we're lucky there, but.
I mean, it's pretty much just the holidays, which like, it's not that it sucks. I mean, I love Christmas music. I'll admit it. Taylor and I listened to Christmas music in like August because we're like, we need this a little bit, like emotionally.
August.
Yeah. Like I like the little things that go with Christmas. I think it's just like the people element of the holidays that I'm like a bit of a Grinch about.
Definitely.
Which I think was also the moral of the Grinch.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I listen to Christmas music for an hour at work before everyone else comes in.
Nice.
Because not everyone I work with celebrates Christmas, so I don't want to like. It's also like not even people who do celebrate Christmas don't always like Christmas music. So I'm like, Milo doesn't like Christmas music, so it's like the one place I'm like alone and I can just have it on in the background. So that's been making me feel a bit festive, but
nice.
Yeah. It's been a weird winter. I feel like it just hasn't really felt like Thanksgiving. It hasn't really felt like,
not to like beat a dead horse with it, but like we're going like with year 2 of this pandemic, and a lot of things just feel kind of like, what are we doing? Like, why are we like, it feels very much like going through the motions and not doing it.
It doesn't have which I think is a good thing. I think we'll come out wanting to simplify things, hopefully.
Yes.
Or at least this new generation will be like, why?
Like reshape it. Reshape it a little bit. I mean, that always happens when you have like a big kind of like cultural reset like this. Where people are like, well, I actually didn't like that, so I'm just gonna, moving forward, continue to not do it.
Yeah.
Like with work stuff.
Yeah.
Not like my job, but like the workforce, like labor shit. Yes.
Capitalism.
The Great Resignation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like we're just so sad. You don't understand. We're not lazy. We're just so sad.
Yeah. Our future has been stripped from us.
Yes. Once again.
Yeah. Once again. Well, today we're talking about...
On that note.
Yeah. We're talking about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And this has been a long time coming. We've been really excited to cover this one.
This is, on record, my favorite book.
Yes.
I love this book. And I think you had talked about it in stories, in our stories on Instagram a little bit, about how like coming to it again, just seeing all of these new elements to it.
Yeah.
It's such a rich text.
It is. It is. And I was kind of like thinking how you think you get it, and then it like and then it just like drenches, like it just becomes more and more, and it kind of piles on, like the themes just kind of pile on. So like the moment you think, oh, this is like a comment on this, or like, oh, and then you're just like, no, this is like, wait, what? No. And then like, I don't know. I just felt that's just kind of how I felt the first time I read it for leisure. And it was very much like, what's the big, what's the hubbub about? And I wanted to kind of like figure it out. And I mean, I think we've discussed this before. It was like, I knew that there was more going on in it, but I just didn't have like the brain power before my master's degree to like really like give it the attention that it deserves.
I mean, you've learned to engage with texts in a new way after King's, after our masters.
Especially after my dissertation.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the stuff that's going on in Frankenstein is very much a response to the French Revolution and what happened, because it just literally changed the world, the Western world in that way, and thought. And so Mary Shelley's this text is very much like a further comment on that, which I was like, oh, I know about that.
And that I do want to talk about that a little bit too, because like as we mentioned in the Wollstonecraft episode, Mary Wollstonecraft died having given birth to Mary Shelley. And from what I understand, it wasn't like the circumstances around it would not have occurred today, because the same doctors who were helping birth children were usually the ones that were taking care of dead bodies. And so that could pass a lot of diseases to recently having given children, women, because like your vagina after you give birth is like an open wound.
Yeah.
And so she contracted a disease, and I think it's something like several days later died.
A couple weeks.
A couple of weeks. And so Mary Shelley's only connection to her mother was through her writing, which was highly philosophical, aggressively pro-woman, pro-liberty, pro-female independence. And so a lot of that definitely comes out in this, which is funny because there's really only 2 female characters. But like the absence of women in the story is very much a point. She's making like a very clear point, which is one of like the superficial readings of this, which is like let's real quick, the full title is, let me find the page real quick, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, alluding to the Greek myth of Prometheus, who tried to successfully gave fire to man, thus like removing gods from the situation. And he was punished for that. And so the main question that Shelley is asking here is about like, what if you remove woman from the equation and just make like man-made life? And as we see, it's a shit show. Like, you can't remove women from the equation.
That's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
Really?
Like, well, I mean, I just never that never occurred to me that it was a comment. Fair, yeah. It makes complete sense. Because it is literally man making life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like when Frankenstein is talking about his process of making his beast, his I think the general consensus is that the monster's name is Adam. So I'm just gonna go with that. Because he's like, when he's talking to Frankenstein at one point, he talks about like he is Frankenstein's Adam, his like first creation.
Right.
So when he's talking about the creation of Adam, he kind of like settles a few times. He's like, well, it was going to be harder to get smaller pieces, so I just settled to make like a gigantic person instead. And it's kind of in a way that she couldn't have anticipated, because that wasn't a conversation at the time, but also bringing in like eugenics. Like, you can choose all you want how you're going to make your children, but it doesn't mean it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of influence from her mother's proto-feminism.
I really noticed too, on the subject of like the process of him creating. I've just been calling him the monster, so that's just what I'm gonna say.
No, that's fair.
Or the creature.
Yeah, I like the creature.
Yeah, I like that. His creature. Is that it's literally said like, and me not to bring up Hannah Arendt in every conversation, but she talks about how during the revolution and the years afterwards, lots of people used the word torrent as like a metaphor for like this irresistibility that happens, like especially with like an example like the French Revolution, when people were, reacting out of necessity. They were starving, they were not being heard or represented, and so they were violent. And so it was described years after as like a torrent, and I just saw that imagery so much with both Frankenstein and his creature, which we'll get into, but because they definitely become a mirror of each other. But Frankenstein, like page 36, my limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance, but then a resistlessness, an almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seem to have lost all soul or sensation, but for this one pursuit. And then later in the text, he talks about how he didn't even know, he can't recall what he was thinking at the time.
Yeah.
Because he was just so consumed.
It feels very like post dissertation.
Yeah.
there was definitely moments where I was like, this is a little triggering for my master's. It feels a little too real.
I remember someone asked me, like when I moved back here and I was meeting someone at work, and they were like, oh, would you write your dissertation on? I'm like, I don't know. I could not tell you. I was like, I have just like blocked it. I blocked it out of because I spent literally every waking hour,
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yep. I was like, I honestly can't tell you.
So that passage specifically got me thinking, and like it's something that pops up before, but that passage about like he knew only that pursuit got me thinking about like the theme of isolation within the novel. Because in the same way that like Frankenstein and the creature are a mirror, like Walton is also this kind of like Frankenstein before he went to school, like as he's like on the verge of this destiny that he has. But he talks about himself growing up. Walton talks about like himself growing up. Him and his sister didn't really go to school. They just like were educated by their uncle's library. And then in like the letters leading up to meeting Frankenstein, he talks about how he doesn't really have a friend. He talks about like that kind of platonic isolation that he's feeling. Even though the men around him are nice and cool, he's like, I don't feel a kinship. And then Frankenstein has a similar upbringing where he even points out like he's got him, his parents, his cousin Elizabeth, and then his two brothers. And he talks about how they were like this unit, like they had their own Eden in this. It's like a lot of like isolated imagery here. And that's not good. Like that's not a good thing. Like humans we are social creatures. We require interaction with others. And so for both of them, what that means is that they come in uneducated to this like pointless endeavor.
Yeah.
Because like Frankenstein studied, Agrippa for like the first 15 years of his life. Pointlessly. Yeah. And then he perpetuates that isolated tendency onto his son, onto the creature. Like it is a form of like, oh god, what's the word for it? Like generational
legacy. Not legacy, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, like he's giving his own generational trauma. He's giving his own generational trauma to the creature. And it's like a cycle that's repeated itself. And that isolation is the reason that the creature ends up the way that he does.
Yeah.
That's a theme I don't think I'd really appreciated before.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give me a minute here. I have notes. You can't not have notes. It's like, I'm not going to be able to pull this from my ass. So there's this really interesting conversation, this letter from Elizabeth to Frankenstein. I'll just quickly read the portion, but it's a farmer's is a very healthy, happy life and the least hurtful, or rather the most beneficial profession of any. My uncle had an idea of his Ernest being educated as an advocate, that through his interest he might become a judge. It is certainly more creditable to cultivate the earth for the sustenance of man than to be the confidant and sometimes the accomplice of his vices, which is the profession of a lawyer. I said, the employments of a prosperous farmer is that they are not a more honorable, they were at least a happier species of occupation than that of a judge, whose misfortune it was always to meddle with the dark side of human nature. And I love this conversation because you're like, you literally have, because she talks about how the judge is the decider of like the human fate. Mm-hmm. And that is what Frankenstein did. Yeah. And rather than using his passions for the sustenance of life, he thought he could decide it as like the judge. And so it's just this interesting conversation that Shelley is having with us from a letter from someone else.
Yeah.
It's almost also a foreshadowing, because Frankenstein's decision not to make a partner for the creature is also him trying to like defy his first decision of making life. Yeah. So all of a sudden now he's accrued this perspective that this is not good. Yeah. And now he has to sustain it, but he can't sustain it because he already like created it.
Yeah. Well, and that also does kind of tie in with like that isolation, because again, like part of the reason Frankenstein or the monster ends up the way that he does is because he doesn't have any kind of healthy human interaction to like guide him.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it with like, it's very animal instinct to acquire your I guess moral compass from the people around you. And you see it with like abandoned kittens and puppies. They don't know how to play.
Yeah.
Because their mother and their siblings were never there. Like you have to like 24/7 constantly be teaching them how to be
socialized and
socialized. And so in refusing to make a partner for the monster, what he also does is perpetuate that isolation. Like the feelings of rejection that the creature had get cemented in, because what he's essentially telling him is you don't deserve somebody else, which is tragic.
Yeah.
Regardless of like, because he's a very great character, the creature.
Yeah. It almost could be a comment on, probably is a comment on like the politics of deciding one's freedoms. Definitely.
Yeah. It feels, because like I said, like the general consensus is that his name is Adam. He's dubbed himself Adam because of their relationship. But I would argue he's more of like an Eve figure, because Eve was the one who ate the fruit from the tree and was gifted the curse of free will.
Right.
And that's essentially what he's done in animating this body, is given the option to choose for himself, and then immediately said, actually, no.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I can't really blame the creature for acting out. I don't approve of his actions, but I don't blame them either.
It's that, so I found that interesting because there's the narrator being like Walton.
Yes, because Walton, I made sure to make note of it. Walton's writing this all down hours after Frankenstein has told him.
Yeah. Doesn't have an opinion either way, really. The way that it's written, the way that Shelley had chosen for us to approach this story is that Frankenstein, I don't want to say sympathetic, but like we're not to be sympathetic, but I think there's an emphasis on sympathy for the creature for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And then you have sympathy on Frankenstein after the death of his brother, and Justine and everyone.
Yeah.
But then at the very end of the book, Walton takes a stand against the creature.
Yeah.
But then the creature has like some of the best words ever written in literature.
Yes. Yes.
Should we get into it?
Yeah, no, I think we should.
Like it. It's this page. He says, "Think ye that the groans of Clerval were music to my ears?" Of just, my heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture, such as you cannot even imagine. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. Evil thenceforth became my good. And now you're like, oh, okay. You're like, I get it.
Yeah. Like you see that like he made a creature and then he made that creature a monster.
Yeah.
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 Like the creature was not always a monster.
But then Walton still takes Frankenstein's side.
Yeah.
When he says, "It is not pity that you feel. You lament only because the victim of your malignity is withdrawn from your power." So now that Frankenstein's dead, like Walton is recognizing that this isn't pity. This is just you have nowhere to exert your power like this. You have
He doesn't get closure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I love that he still gets the last word because Walton has to go home. But the creature's like, I'm going to go north. So it's like he actually does do what Walton was set out to do. So it's almost like this kind of like you were saying generational trauma, but it's almost like this is like the last, like the legacy of like this, because there's also this theme of like this insurmountableness, like when the monster takes Frankenstein up to the mountain to like tell him his story, he says like this is this insurmountable like mountain as this like metaphor for like what they're doing, which is like not without the ability to be complete, right? Like there's just never going to be like a right or a wrong at this point because you've just defied nature.
It also kind of like, so I mean, this is the original sci-fi,
right?
And one common drawing for this common theme in sci-fi is this like rising up of things that we've created. So you, like iRobot, like the androids that take over.
It's okay.
Can you hear it?
Not really. A little bit, but
okay. But okay, sorry. I completely lost my train of thought. That's a part of why I stopped. No. It's because it sounded like she was just yelling into my door. I thought she was talking to me for a second. Okay. Androids. And so the creature could almost be viewed as this like next step, almost in like human evolution. Like a man-made kind of version. I think I've talked about this before, but if you've ever seen the show Kyle XY, it was on ABC Family like
I remember it. I didn't really watch it
15 years ago. Yeah. The whole premise is that he was born in a test tube, and so he didn't have a belly button and all this stuff, but he also had, so again, removing that mother element, that the woman, the necessity of like a woman within this thing. They still used an egg and everything, but because he wasn't born from a woman, for some reason that meant that he could like heal people by touching them. He had like strange powers and abilities, all that kind of stuff. So where like Walton is attempting to do this first feat for man as this kind of like next step in man's development, the creature is able to actually do it. Like doing what the people before him were unable to do.
Right.
In spite of the monster that they've turned him into, the monster that he was like potentially destined to be just by the fact that he didn't have a mother. Which, and I do want to clarify on that. I don't think people without mothers are monsters, but that is something that like Shelley herself is also working through in writing this, because by this point her relationship with her father was extremely strained, and she never knew her mother. All she had was a stepmother who, for better or worse, tried her best, but was no Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yeah, because they Godwin kept the portrait of Wollstonecraft above the mantle.
Yep.
Like their entire life.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So it was definitely a big legacy, a big kind of like big shoes to fill. And so like this like almost like specter of her mom throughout her life is like she wants to make sure that she can do better.
Yeah.
But she also has to reconcile the grief that she feels that she's not able to like properly process.
Yeah. kind of a thought on isolation that you had was there. Sorry, real quick, I have to find it because
you're good.
I'm gonna find it better in the book because I read it.
It's fair. It's fair.
So, the monster is isolated because of his appearance. Really, he becomes isolated because of that. He becomes a monster himself of murder through the unwillingness to have community, right? But then Frankenstein is isolated because he is now haunted by this vengeful creature. So he becomes isolated like the monster, accused of something. When he gets when the creature murders someone in Ireland, and then Frankenstein gets like accused of it.
Yeah.
And it's like he gets accused of something he didn't do, but then the creature gets accused of something he isn't.
Yes.
Because, and it's like this dejection of self versus like dejection of like essential freedom, because yes, like the creature is not free, but what am I trying to say? The Frankenstein's not free because this creature lives in isolation. So then it's almost like Frankenstein almost self-isolates because of that like layer. I don't know. There's like just a lot going on. Yeah.
Well, it's like out of guilt.
Yeah.
And I think he's right in feeling that guilt, because when he's accused of that, of the murder, I would argue that he is like 50% responsible for it.
Oh yeah.
Because
he even calls himself the murderer.
Like instead of like confronting like his mistake, not that the creature itself is a mistake, but the fact that he even tried to perverse like the laws of nature like this was a mistake. And instead of recognizing that that mistake is sentient with a conscience and wants and needs similar to his own, he rejects it. And it would have been not easy, but the harder choice, or the easy choice, is to deny this creature community. The harder but the more ethical choice would have been to confront it and see what to do. Like in Young Frankenstein, for a moment.
Frankenstein.
And yes, sorry, Frankenstein. So Gene Wilder makes the creature again. Because isn't he supposed to be technically like Frankenstein's like great grandson or something?
Yeah.
But instead of like rejecting the creature, granted, not the best, like I'm not saying this is what Frankenstein should have done, but he shows him. He says, "Look at what I did." And they have like this show together. Like that's how I learned about the song "Putting on the Ritz." And so he presents it to society in this frame of, look at what I did. And so if Frankenstein in the original text had, in a more scientific, ethical, natural philosophy, natural philosophical way, presented this as, look at what I did, it is far less likely that the creature would have gone around murdering people just because he didn't get dad's attention.
Yeah.
He might have had a slightly higher opinion of the value of a human life.
Mm-hmm.
But his existence shows also Frankenstein's inability to see the value of human life, the value of life.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like the dichotomy of life and death is one of the few where it's like genuinely like a dichotomy, like they're very clearly defined.
Yeah.
And that's partially what like gives one worth over, not over the other, but like in tangent with the other. And so when you remove one, it's just chaos.
Yeah. Do you think he had, was it, it doesn't really go into too much. Maybe it does. And I was kind of looking for it though, is early in the book when he's like doing research and figuring out how he can do this. What is it, ambition? Is he wanting, is that what he's wanting, is look what I can do kind of thing? Like what gets him to that manic point of not
he
being able to make sound judgments, right?
pretty much, yeah. I think like he doesn't talk about it in this, like he was actively pursuing the reversal of death, but that like his studies had kind of led him there.
Mm-hmm.
And then one night he just like discovers the solution. And he refuses to tell, but like I think there is a specific line where he says, I couldn't tell you what I was thinking at the time.
Yeah.
Or what my actual endeavor was for. I just had to do it.
Yeah, it's
like this kind of like compulsion.
yeah, like kind of like I was saying earlier, like this irresistibility, like
Yeah.
you can't it's no longer controllable. And
Yeah.
this continues to happen. So he has this kind of like irresistible impulse urge, right, to like create this thing. But he is not addressing or facing its fruit.
Yeah.
He has no idea what's going to happen after it happens until it
Yep.
happens, and then he immediately rejects it.
Yep.
And runs from it and is scared of it.
And then he's like sick for like a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um
And not and then once the creature kills Ernest, Justine is blamed.
mhm.
And it's this irresistible process of just like death, right?
Yeah.
That is it's uncontrollable. There's nothing like that can be done.
Well,
that
the
just
funny
kind of
thing
keeps
too
going.
is, well, sorry, it's just,
Oh yeah.
if he had been honest about his creation of the creature, if the community had known that he existed, then Justine wouldn't have been blamed.
I think part of it too is I don't think people would believe him, because there's that point where he goes to the lawyer afterwards,
Yeah.
the attorney, and they're like, "Uh-huh, okay."
The lie at that point is just like so big.
Yeah.
Like it should have been immediately upon the creature's birth that somebody had been notified.
Yeah. But then after all this death, the guilt, the grief, he isolates, right?
Yeah.
Like it's this irresistible process of them both becoming a monster.
Yeah. It's definitely like the line from Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum's like, you were so focused on whether or not you could, you didn't think about whether you should.
Yeah. The ethics.
That's just like, that sums up like half of sci-fi.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the sympathetic nature of the creature is definitely a huge gray area, a huge like a huge question mark, like the level of sympathy that we're meant to feel towards him, the level of agency over his actions that we're meant to read into it. I think, because that's another, like, that's one of those things where I mean, I've read this a few times now, mostly for class, and it's something I think I go back and forth on. It's definitely, it's like, it's not a clear-cut answer. It wasn't supposed to be, because so much of it comes down to like Frankenstein's handling. Frankenstein's it comes down to his like handling of the situation, and this question of like nature versus nurture, which was at this time still, I don't want to say like a budding thought, but it was kind of fresh. Yeah, like the general consensus before had been more nature. I think at one point he even talks about like where he got the body parts from would have been like criminals, and so he was literally constructed of the bodies of perceived very evil men. And so the question of like how much of that influences his behavior as well. I think an original question nowadays would be like, well, that's stupid, that's not a thing, but that's something that Shelley would have. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, at the time, you're coming from kind of like the medieval idea of the body and what it means, which body parts symbolized the soul, how they acted and stuff. So your body was a direct like representation of like your soul, and whether you were a good person or not. And so that it just makes a lot of sense. And you're coming out of that in the 18th century. You're starting to understand that, we're made of our minds, you know?
Yes. Just a very fun way to demonize people with different bodies, people with disabilities, people who look different than you, is to say that it's actually a sign of their own lack of morality.
Exactly. Which happened
just
a lot.
Fun European things.
Which happened a lot in the French Revolution as well. There's that awful march they had where they took Marie Antoinette's friend and like, chopped her parts and just like marched them around because there was this like obsession with body parts and like, well, not body parts, but just like sexuality and like how like, Marie Antoinette got like a lot of like shit during that time because of what the society was grappling with, which was just very interesting.
Well, I do think like obsession with body parts is a good phrase for it, because like it's this obsession with like the relation between the body and the mind, which definitely came out of, at that point, like Christian thoughts around like the body and sin. And so I think it was almost this response, this like rational response, trying to subvert that in, what's the word I'm looking for, in like medicalizing the body, because around this time is when you get like the public, or not public, but we had talked about this before, the because you get that whole Hogarth print where they're doing the human dissection. It's like a theater. Like you've got full seating, there's doctors in the center who are in the middle of like explaining these things to you, and like side note, criminals were the ones who this happened to, so that's why we know that criminals were the body parts used for the creature. But like this attempt to medicalize the body gave this like weird fascination with the body on its own, not as an extension of the soul. But then you're like, if it's not this, then what is it?
Right. Yeah.
So then further, I was like, what is it once you've reanimated it?
Right.
What parts come alive? What parts are inherent to the body?
Yeah. And I love her descriptions too of the physical sensations that Frankenstein and the monster would like exhibit. Like they would be like, I would faint or have like convulsions, like this almost like physical hysteria.
He just needed to get laid,
which is very not very much not like a masculine thing. Like,
yes, yeah.
Which I thought was interesting. Like he faints a couple times. He like has to leave the room because he can't like contain himself.
He's so overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about women anymore? I'm happy to jump back on that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, kind of like what I said, like the absence of women in the story is like a big tool that she uses to kind of like raise that question of what if. But Elizabeth becomes the figure in what I would argue is a cautionary tale of like the ideal woman. But she used like Elizabeth is like a really common name in romantic novels. She is this kind of romantic character that's been just jammed and stuffed into the very gothic science fiction tale. And she's rather passive, not surprisingly, since she's like playing that role, or since like she's been cookie cut that way. And so this is another area that I think like the Wollstonecraft and Shelley is coming out, because like if she, and I like, again, like not really like placing any kind of blame on her, but like if she'd had a more active role, if she'd been written as a more active character, then Frankenstein himself might have had a much different relationship with the events that happened. Because he like talks about forgetting basically his entire family and all of like their letters and everything during the months that he was working on his experiments. And all of that happened shortly after his mother's death. And Elizabeth becomes this like this kind of like ignorant player in all of the games, because she's not meant to have agency from the very beginning though. So we're introduced to her, this is another bit of isolation that kind of like just the recurring theme in it. When we get the story of how Elizabeth came to be with them, her father had, or sorry, not Elizabeth. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of his mother. But so Elizabeth comes and his mother is immediately like, they're going to get married. I want them to marry. And so from the beginning, even though they were raised in this, like, again, what he quotes as their own little Eden, she was never raised as a sister. She was always raised as like the betrothed.
Yeah.
Yep. As a very specific role that she's meant to fill. And the second the mother dies, the mother who had, when she was a very young child, taken care of her father after isolating the family, turns to Elizabeth and says, now it's your turn. It's like, now you have to take the weight of everything that I've been carrying for the last 20 years. 30 years, probably. And I'm going to say unwillingness that Elizabeth has in taking this, not that she ever rejects it, but that she's never really given the choice. It's just expected now that she will play the maternal role for the boys.
Yeah.
She's just automatically expected to do that, which a lot of women, you enter a new stage and like you're just expected into this new pedestal.
Yeah, you take on the boy child. You be his mother.
He's not expected to grow up.
Yeah.
He can make all the mistakes he wants, but now that she's out of the picture, you have to be the new one.
Yeah. Well, and it's around the time, it's when she's speaking with Justine in prison. And Frankenstein's just kind of in the corner, like wallowing because he knows. And it's like, that would have been a good time to tell her what's going on.
Yeah.
Also, their wedding night, when he's like, I'm going to tell her tomorrow. And it's like, like he's such a coward.
Yes, exactly. Like he's so afraid of facing the consequences of his actions. And this is like the consequence of that isolation.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't know how to cope with his mother's death because he's never experienced anybody outside of his immediate family. And so when faced with that, what happens? He commits a great sin against nature. And he's never, so like repeatedly all of these times when he should have done like all the things we're saying, like he could have done this if he, like it would have led to this. The fact that he doesn't is directly related to the fact that he's never had to like atone for the consequences of his actions in his entire life. He talks about it being a paradise.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
this very
we're not
detached
given
view.
much. Yeah, we're not given much about his like early life in terms of like, yeah. I do think like one person we haven't talked a lot about is Henry Clerval.
I love Henry.
Me too.
I tear up every time he dies. I cried the first time.
Oh, yeah. It is really sad. So like this time I didn't remember that he died, and I was like, what?
Yeah.
I was really upset. But he becomes this like dream of like, he literally, Frankenstein says the word dream a lot when he's talking about Henry and their time together, because he is the dream that Frankenstein wants, but knows he can never have. And then right after, there's a lot of parallels. After he makes the creature and he gets sick, he goes to be with Henry and they're at the college or whatever. The moment he writes to his family, Ernest dies.
Yep.
Ernest is murdered. The moment that just after Frankenstein destroys the second creature he would have made, Henry is murdered. Like the companionship, the dream, right?
Yep.
It's really interesting. A lot of parallels.
Well, especially because like Frankenstein and Elizabeth, Victor and Elizabeth would have essentially become like parents to Ernest.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like the relational dynamic that was emerging. And so his rejection of the monster led to his inability also to be a father to Ernest.
Yeah.
And then his refusal of a companion for the monster leads to the removal of his own highest companion. Because like, yes, him and Elizabeth are going to get married, but the relationship between Victor and Henry is far deeper.
Yeah.
That is his companion.
And Henry is the first person in the book to say his name, Frankenstein. I noticed that. No one says Frankenstein, not even Walton.
Not even Walton.
Yeah.
I was like waiting for it, and I was like, why is...
Yeah, it's like, he says, oh, Frankenstein, and you're like, so you're just immediately like given this like anchor of like, this is who knows him, you know?
Yep. Just like the use of the name.
Yeah.
Shows there, yeah.
Henry
Clerval's probably one of my favorite characters in literature.
Really?
And am I just like, he's not that deep, I would even say.
I mean, he doesn't have a lot of exposition. Like, there's not a lot.
Yeah. But I think because even without that, you can see his importance to Victor, which is not easy to do without, like you said, without that like excessive exposition. Because we get it with Elizabeth, we get it with his mother, we get it with Frankenstein and with Walton, but Clerval is like this very pivotal figure who doesn't really exist so much outside of his relationship to Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say something, I forget what it is. It's okay. I think I was gonna say, I forgot. It's okay. It's gone.
Okay. It might come back. Come back.
Another theme that kind of came up a lot was nature, which
Mhm.
this is where kind of the romantic element kind of comes
Yeah.
through. Is you have the nature, it's kind of the role that nature has in romantic literature
Mhm.
is that it's a way to show, it's like the it's like the foil to what's happening inside of you,
Yeah.
so that you can look upon nature and see how you're doing, essentially.
Yeah.
If you're depressed, everything's gonna look depressing.
Dreary. Yeah.
um or be at odds because you're at odds with how you feel. So
Mhm.
a lot of what's going on in this is like the moment he creates the monster, it's like stormy.
You can almost like see the strikes of lightning
Yeah,
against the window
yeah,
as like the the Hollywood versions are very, very off from the book. I think the like Kenneth Branagh version is as close as it gets, and I don't necessarily recommend it.
yeah.
Um, but they all really, really nailed down that night of the final creation,
Mm-hmm.
where you've got like the storm and the flashing and the wind buckling the windows, kind of like they really grasped that.
Yeah,
Like nature's basically fighting back. They're like, no, you shouldn't be doing
yeah, they're
this.
like something's wrong.
Yes.
Something's
Yeah.
wrong. It's like an alarm.
Yeah. Yeah.
um but I love the moon plays a really big role. The moon is what Frankenstein looks upon that night. The moon is also the thing that the creature looks upon when he first can gain sight, and he says he
Mm-hmm.
looked upon it with pleasure. The moon shines on um, Elizabeth, who is no longer Elizabeth, he says,
Mm-hmm.
but this body, right? And it's just, and it, obvious. It's pretty textbook of just like illumination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another part too was, like I said earlier, how when the monster takes Frankenstein up into the mountain, and he's like this place where no one this insurmountable, like impossible place to reach.
Mm-hmm.
But then the monster says, I love going to these icy caves because no one else, like, this is not a place where, like, he calls it his hovel,
Yeah.
um because no one else can go there. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what Frankenstein, or that's what the monster is this, if we're going to comment on kind of the psychological aspect of this, kind of like what we're talking about in the Gothic um episode of just how
Yeah.
like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of dichotomy of, is the monster this thing inside of us that we're rejecting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like he likes to go live places where no one can find him and no one can
Yeah.
survive and no one can like explore. And then but then the moon at night illuminates this, like it's this very, very Gothic, like.
Yeah.
So I just loved how, and like the natural aspects of the book where like uh Frankenstein is like going for walks, going in for hikes, and he's having a good old time, but then like melancholy descends upon him, and then
Yeah.
all of a sudden he's just like at odds with nature. And then you see like these huge parallels between the monster and him, and their um when the monster is out looking for um can you see my cat?
I can see the little tail. Yes, I just
She's
saw
on
like the
the
tail kind of pop out in the mirror.
yeah, she's like, I have a cat tree like right here, so
Mm-hmm. I
um
can see like the reverse of it.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so like their reactions to nature, like you'll have a reaction, the monster will have this reaction to nature, and then Frankenstein will have the same one. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, so then you're like, they're like descending down the same like path, and it's just
Yeah.
really cool the way that happens.
It's I can't you said something and I can't remember what it was. What it got me thinking about, like, again in the theme of isolation. is, what if the monster isn't, okay, let me,
is it the psychological?
so we've been reading this as like the monster gets rejected, and so that's why he isolates. Mm-hmm. And that's generally how I read the novel. But also, if we were to look at this as, so that's like the nurture side of it. He's been nurtured into this isolation. Mm-hmm. If we were to look at it from the nature point of view, one of the, I guess, consequences of Frankenstein's subversion of the natural order then is the creature's isolation, the creature's need for isolation, and how that can like create the monster within us. And so he,
oh, you mean his need for a companion is like,
no, like the opposite. Like he created a creature who was destined for isolation. Mm-hmm. Like I said, like humans are social creatures. We require socialization. Mm-hmm. All animals require some level of socialization. But what if another side effect of what Frankenstein had done is that he's created a creature that does not require companionship? Like it is like a base need for us, but what if it isn't for him? And so that's why he also starts to descend, is because just by the very fact of his creation, he's been allowed like to be unchained from that. But and like that doesn't change the reading of like he committed these crimes 100%. But he committed them because he doesn't have the capacity to see what he's doing wrong, almost. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Because I think there is this sense of need that he does have, though. Like he has kind of like, he sees the photo of the mother and is like, oh, she had like delicate eyes and full lips, mm-hmm. but I have been deprived of this, of ever like having
I'm not talking about like his desire for it, but like a base instinctual requirement for survival, kind of like humans actually require that for survival. It's why you have to hold babies. Like babies can physically die of loneliness because of that, whereas
he doesn't need it to survive.
Yeah, and I feel like that definitely kind of changes his experience of that isolation and that rejection, because humans don't normally, in response to rejection and isolation, go out and kill. But if you've created this being who, by consequence of what you've done, doesn't require that for survival, then they're going to act out on that desire, or that denial of the desire, in a much different way.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you like when you're struggling with something, like, for lack of a better analogy, but like when people who are like homophobic sometimes end up being like gay because of like the way that it's been projected onto them.
Yes.
To be like disgusted with it. It's kind of like that, where it's like he was born of this state that doesn't require companionship. Mm-hmm. And so he's acting out against companionship almost.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
I would still argue that like it's Frankenstein's fault, because it's like a byproduct of his experiment.
I mean, it's all his fault.
Oh yeah, God, he is the monster. Like I remember seeing this Tumblr post where it's like, Frankenstein's not the monster, Frankenstein's the doctor. And it's like, well, if you read it, Frankenstein technically is the monster. Yeah. There is, so I do kind of want to shift gears though real quick, because she references Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Mm-hmm. And I think it's funny because she references it with Walton, and Walton is like I wear no albatross yet, or something. I'm typing. He wasn't typing, he was writing.
Yeah.
He alludes to it. But then there's this moment right as Frankenstein is starting to reveal his story and his history, where it takes that darker turn, like it does in Mariner, where you're like, oh no, he's about to get his albatross. He's about to get his weight. Because I think in that one, it's a poem, and essentially like the seafarer comes on the ship, tells us, or not onto the ship, but he like tells a story, and like he passes the curse. That's the sense that you get. And so that feels like this, because again, like you mentioned, like right at the end, after Frankenstein has finished his tale, the creature is taken off, he's like, Walton's just like, I'm coming home now. Like he's
like, I'm out.
Yeah, peace. He doesn't get his end, his heroic scientific discovery like he intended. But he has to bear the weight of this knowledge now for the rest of his life, that there's just this thing out there. This golem of like scientific perversion that now just exists. And like you said with like Frankenstein, he does try to tell people, they don't believe him. And so even if Frankenstein, okay, so let's say for like shits and giggles for a moment that the creature hadn't shown up, Walton would have really only had Frankenstein's word, like his story, to, and like the one like kind of quarter-mile away sighting that they'd had at the very beginning of the book. There's no reason that he should have believed him. But then the creature showing up and confirming what's just like the tale that's just unfolded is what he now has to live with for the rest of his life, which I can't imagine that. Like, knowing that there's just this monster out there.
Yeah.
I'd be terrified.
That found the North Pole and you didn't.
yeah. Like he is he's claimed both scientists now, both of their wins for himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that the text. I mean, I haven't read that, but the chest of books that the creature finds has like, everything you need, right? It has Milton, and it had the Sorrows of Young Werther, which we read in our class. And so now reading this again, I'm like, oh, I know like the reference to that, and like how so like kind of the premise of that book is that Werther falls in love with this woman almost like delusionally. It's kind of like 500 Days of Summer. Did you ever see that? Kind of like that. That it becomes a source of his own mortality. If she won't accept him, right? Like, what is there to live for? So that's kind of essentially like the creature's like under because he doesn't have the socialization, was able to glean that and almost like imitates it, or not imitate, what am I trying to say, like subsumes this like ideology of like, this is what I need, or I die.
And like one of the big things that we talked about in the Wollstonecraft discussion was her grasp on social conditioning and education. And so now, because Frankenstein, Jesus.
You have said it a few times and I didn't correct you.
I know. Well, I'm sure at some point I'll also say
like
Frankenstein. Yeah. Thank you.
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
Yep.
It's going to be all four ways. Because he refuses also, like, the rejection wasn't just of him as a person, which on its own is pretty fucking terrible. But in rejecting him also denies proper education, which we know is important to him because of the very beginning when he's kind of talking about the arrival of Elizabeth. basically what had happened was that like his father's sister married an Italian. They moved to Italy. His sister died, or his aunt dies, and then the husband writes to the father and says, "Would you rather her be raised by a stepmother or educate her yourself?" And immediately, just like immediate response is, goes to Italy, picks her up and brings her home. So this kind of like almost theme, but I think maybe more of a motif, because it happened to Walton too, where like Walton's parents died, and so they made sure that he was educated within the family. His uncle took them in. He learned from his uncle's library. The prevalence of like familial education is important, and so in rejecting that opportunity to the monster's only choice then is to learn from these things. And so that like lack of proper education is a big stepping like block, I guess, for the creature.
Well, yeah, and the interesting idea of him spectating and not participating is really interesting. Like that's
very
kind of how he learns. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a thick boy. I mean, it's really only
like 92.
Yeah.
100
really small.
I recently put it in my 197.
Yeah, it's not long at all.
No, that's the appendix. 191.
Yep. I have the second Norton Critical Edition.
I've never owned one of those, but you have a lot of those.
Yeah, well, because it was all at ASU. ASU really pushed these versions, at least when I went there.
Yeah.
And I've always been a stickler about like getting the ones, and it's because I want to follow along in class. And it was always so frustrating because they'd want you to get like the really expensive ones. And they're like, you need to get these because of the essays at the very end. Right. And then you get to that section, like that lesson, and they're like, in case anyone didn't get this copy of the book, I've scanned the essay that was at the end and required reading online. You can access it here. That's fine. I just paid $30 for a book. I'm fine.
Yeah.
This did actually have some really good essays. One of them particularly on the female within Frankenstein, son of a bitch. Which is why that was, I think, something that I've always paid attention to when reading this. Yeah.
Well, I have the Oxford World Classics.
That's a pretty one.
I really like it. I think the monster looks really fucking awesome.
Yes.
Like that's the monster in the book. Like there's this like at the end when he's like leaving and Walton is like the look on his face. Like,
yeah.
The new Oxford World's Classic has a different like cover, but this one was like, I bought this like in 2015 or something. So anyway, I don't think it has essays. I didn't read the essays if they did.
I don't know that the Oxford Classics did.
There's an introduction and then a bunch of appendices. Appendices.
Right, that's a nice word. One of my favorite things about this though is it's not like book related. So this one includes the introduction by Percy Shelley.
Nice.
He doesn't cite himself, but he has this one line. Oh gosh, where is it? Oh, sorry, I'm not in the. So he's talking about like the night that they all decided like let's write scary stories together when they were out in
Geneva.
Thank you, Geneva. I was gonna say Genovia.
Yep.
Thank you.
God, please.
He says, the weather, however, suddenly became serene, and my two friends left me on a journey among the Alps and lost in the magnificent scenes which they present all memory of their ghostly visions. The following tale is the only one which has been completed. And so I love that he finishes off his introduction where he's pretending to be Mary Shelley with like an excuse for not finishing his own story.
Yeah.
Like just like a man to make the very last thing about him.
Yeah.
Which is, as much as I love their love story, she could have done better.
I think so.
Yeah.
Like Shelley, if we kind of want to get into it a little bit, Shelley's like not, he's very much like the guy all of the girls like want.
Yeah.
And so then Mary gets him and then realizes he's not as like he's kind of all fluff. I mean, he wrote some amazing things. Don't get me wrong. He's really very talented and everything. But he's just in debt and just like,
he is your classic like poet soft boy.
Like I was literally gonna say he's like so romantic. Yeah, he's like one of the originals. Like obviously he's really romantic, but I mean that in like they just took off to go to France and live like this like life.
It's like
bohemian kind of like like romantic like ideal of something, and then they get there and they're like sick and like
he can't
like,
actually
the whole time on the carriage.
It.
Yeah, the whole time on the carriage, like to like Dover, she's just like throwing up because she's just like, oh my god, we're leaving. What's this? What's going on?
She's like, wow, so romantic.
Yeah,
like
and then they get there and it's like, you know, and no one knows who's sleeping with who, and it's just like this really like And then Byron's like another piece of work, but
he's a whole that's a whole thing. It feels because Mary Shelley is very much like her mother, like she's walking the walk. She has these philosophies and she's willing to live by them. Whereas Percy seems like he's just using them to support his own assholery, if that's a word.
He's doing it for like almost legacy or like to be known.
He's doing it just because like he can. She's doing it to make a point. It feels like when you like have, well, it's more common or more, I guess, like publicly known now, polyamory. And a big question for or about it from like monogamous people tends to be like, well, isn't that just cheating? And so like people who are like in a healthy manner practicing polyamory or polygamy are people who, one, have a lot of trust in each other, two, have like set like certain boundaries and rules around what that'll look like for them. And if I were to like classify them, like Mary and Percy, Mary definitely falls on the side of like she's cool doing it. She's like we can set our proper like boundaries about our relationship, about like what we feel safe and secure with. Whereas he's getting into this because he just like can't be tied down, dude. Like, he doesn't want to like put limits on himself, which is like not the kind of person you want to be with when you're polyamorous.
Well, he's the one that wants to do it and she's okay with it.
Yes.
Like she wasn't the one that's like, ooh, I really want to like sleep with this person. It's like because at there gets to a point where she's kind of, I wouldn't say
because
she's kind of frustrated because she's left at home with the baby.
Yeah.
Well, he can kind of do whatever he wants, you know.
But
there's
like,
a little
that's what
tension
I mean. It's like,
there. Yeah.
He doesn't respect the boundaries. She's like, we can do this, but like here's like how we do it in a way that's healthy for us. And he's like, no, babes.
And then
which is not.
And then he dies in a sea storm.
Yeah, which is like poetic or something.
Yeah.
And then she just lives the rest of her life with his calcified heart in her desk. So.
Ooh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Very gothic.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that for her.
Yeah.
Not the fact that like he was kind of a dick.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, so final thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so glad we did this because I really needed to read it. And when I read it, I was just like, I'm going to like scribble all over this book. I'm going to give this my all, you know, because it's like it's such a gem. Like
it is.
It's such a gem. And yeah, I mean, it was like, it exceeded my expectations again. I was like, oh, and then another thing, and then another, like I said, like it's kind of this irresistible like thing where the questions are never answered. Like it's, the book is a question, and it's, nothing gets resolved because it can't be resolved. It's insurmountable. It's inaccessible to our like existence, to create life without women, to like create life
from death
is like, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I was never bored.
Yeah. I've been very vocal in the past about like, I don't reread. This is always a book that I'm happy to reread for the very reasons that you mentioned, because especially as I get older, because I think the first time I read it was like junior year of undergrad, junior or sophomore year. And it always has something like new to give you. It's such a beautiful text, honestly. Like her writing is amazing. It's gorgeous. The story behind the creation of the book is epic. And the fact that like one of the fears that she's going into this, like uncovering, knowingly or unknowingly, around like the legacy that she has, being Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin's child, especially because like we kind of talked about in the Wollstonecraft discussion, like Wollstonecraft, in being published with this, is starting this lineage of like feminist discourse. And even though like it's not radical now, it was then. Like it started everything. It got the ball rolling. It was a very tiny ball when she had it, and now it's a very big. And that's great. She started science fiction with this. And so she's almost like living up to that legacy of starting this new, for her it was like an entire fucking genre. It wasn't just like a discourse. It was like its own monster that has come so far.
And I like, love that it started with the creation of life. Like that's where she started. It's like, and it's not like the source, the origins, like
yes, exactly. Like it's this Adam figure, this Adam and Eve, this Eden, this constant like creation myth is like repeated throughout of it. And the themes haven't really dwindled in science fiction at all, because I mentioned Frankenstein, or I mentioned Jurassic Park. It's the same premise. It's just dinosaurs this time, but it's the same story, more or less. They don't become very literate, but the same kind of like, you were so focused on whether or not you didn't think about the consequences of your actions. And just the weight of that, it's very hard to create this perfectly new original story. We read a lot of YA on the channel as well, and a lot of YA is kind of just like a remix of Pride and Prejudice, or a remix of Hades and Persephone, redo of this and that. But this was like an original. This was his own brand new thing. I'm so proud of it. I love it so much.
I'm so proud of it for her.
Yes, I am. She lived a very long life. She got to see like the fruits of,
that's good.
Long life for the 1800s.
Exactly. Well, cool. I think that's, oh my gosh, I feel like I can like take a deep breath now, because that's like such a, like I'm just like, it was just like such a roller coaster this week of like reading that, and like I've been really excited to talk to you about it. Now we go back to YA. And then we will go to Wuthering Heights, which is my favorite book of all time. And explore that. So that I'm so excited. So yeah.
Damn.
Until next week.
Until next week. Wait. What are we reading next week?
The Cruel Prince by Holly Black.
Yeah.
I've already started a little bit about it, and it's really cool world. Really cool.
I'm excited to get back into like the Fae. So I've never read I think that when you say the Fae, people are like Sarah J. Maas. Yeah. I've never read her, which we've talked about.
Yes.
But I did read like fairies and stuff when I was younger. And so I'm excited to get back into that. They can be really, really fun.
They're really intense.
Yes. And they have this almost like what has been translated in like to Christian lore, like it's almost kind of like devil, like demon, not in like a negative way, but they play with your words. They'll give you half truths. Like you always have to be reading between the lines with them. I love that kind of stuff. So I'm excited.
Cool.
I'm excited.
Yay.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Until next week.
All right. Bye.
Happy reading.
Happy reading.
Bye.
Bye.